Hey everybody, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement. I am your host, Philip Ideson. Corporate travel is one of the most complex spend categories that procurement leads, and has been in a state of flux resulting from the global COVID-19 pandemic. How should your corporate travel policy change to reflect new realities? How do you negotiate deals when volumes are uncertain? How do you account for traveller safety? And how do you integrate sustainability into your travel program? We'll cover all of these pressing issues in this 4-part special series brought to you by Art of Procurement in partnership with Egencia, the world's business travel platform. Today, in the final episode of our series, I spoke to Kristina Zdrilic Siljedahl, a global account manager and sustainability ambassador at Egencia, to discuss the tactics and metrics that companies can use to integrate sustainability into their travel program. For context, I started by asking Kristina if you could share a little bit about her current role.
Yes, I'm happy to. So I'm working as a global account manager today within Egencia. And I've been with Egencia for about 5 years, but I've been in the travel industry for about 30 years in different roles. And some of them has actually been within procurement.
Today's conversation is around sustainability and the considerations that we need to make from our corporate travel programs and from our traveling in terms of sustainability. Now, how can procurement set goals and objectives that helps it contribute to an organization's sustainability targets?
Yes. So first of all, our advice is really to agree on a baseline to be able to follow up. You know, when you start setting goals and objectives, really be clear. And this is the year that we're starting measuring. We're going back to, if it's 2 or 3 years back, whatever makes sense. My recommendation would be year pre-COVID, and then start measuring on different levels that make sense for the organization.
What are the kind of metrics, or what would you actually want to baseline then to actually begin to measure against or to see the impact in helping in sustainability and travel?
So that's a very wide question. So if we specifically look at business travel, there are metrics that are common to follow up on. And I would say, I think the most common metric within procurement is to focus on cost. But there are areas that are important to take into consideration, and they're increasing in interest. So the metrics, I mean, obviously we do focus a lot on sustainability metrics like CO2 emissions per product. But if you look at products, I think the biggest groups are air, then hotel, rail, and car. And in particular, rail is big within Europe and certain markets. So those are the big areas. And then you can follow up on other things as well that are more related towards traveler behavior and well-being.
When it comes to measuring from a CO2 emissions perspective, for example, where does that data actually come from? And does that differ based on the mode, you know, whether it's air, hotel, rail, or car?
Yes. So you need to be aware of how it's being calculated. So for instance, within Egencia, we use a method called DEFRA. So either you measure against DEFRA or GHG. So that's number one. And then most travel management companies, they have reporting available in the systems and also along the booking pass. So for instance, if you book an air trip, you will have indicators along the way when you do your booking that this flight will be this amount of emissions, CO2 emissions. If you take a direct flight, this is the number. And if you take a flight and you switch planes on the way, this will be the emission, you know. So it's on the booking pass, and then it's also available through reporting.
And so would you be looking at this from, let's say, a top level, these are the CO2 emissions associated with my travel program, or some kind of micrometrics, like on a per trip basis?
Correct. So our recommendation would actually be to try to have a holistic approach. So you need to decide if you're going to measure it on company level, department level, perhaps business unit level, and then individual level, and then break it down to the products that you're using. So if you're traveling by air, it's important to measure per trip or per segment. You have a choice of doing either trip or segment. And then also to follow up on rail trips, for instance, and then hotel. You can also follow up on that, but it turns out that it varies a bit, between hotel chains and destinations. And then when it comes to car, it's not possible to pull reports because obviously we don't get the final mileage of the trip. So that will be difficult. You will have to get that through the car suppliers.
Now, when you're thinking about the ROI, you're responsible for the category, for the travel category. You're passionate about driving a sustainability agenda. You see value in it. You need to sell that to your organization. So we've talked about CO2 emissions and measuring CO2 emissions, but is there a way to build an ROI on top of that goes beyond emissions into financial impact?
Yes, no, I think that's an excellent question, and we see a lot of movement on this. And I've been fortunate to work with quite a few different companies, and some have come very far, some have just started. So my advice is, for procurement departments is really to be involved internally with your departments and interact and try to measure different things, not just cost. So I think now, in particular with the pandemic situation, there's a lot of focus on, total travel time, well-being, and things like that. And also the recommendations that we give is that some of the trips that used to take place in the past, meeting face-to-face, they have been replaced by virtual meetings. So if you haven't started to measure the virtual meetings within your organization, my advice is really to start doing that now, because that will give you the complete picture, Yeah. So this meeting is taking place virtually or face to face, and then try to measure return on investment that makes sense for you.
Now, if you are encouraging your team to travel more sustainably for the first time, you're just starting this initiative. Are there some basic actions that you should recommend your travelers to take to be able to travel in a more sustainable way?
Yeah, absolutely. So for instance, if you have a distance which is possible to take either by air or by rail, our recommendation would be then to travel by rail. If it's within, I would say, reasonable time. So if I take Sweden, for instance, where I'm based, we have certain trips that are within 3 hours, where it actually takes equally long to go from door to door by, first transport to the airport and then an airplane, and then the last pass to your end destination, compared to if you go by rail from door to door and city to city. So our first advice would really to see, are there any options to travel in a different mode, for instance, by rail? So that's number one. If it's not possible to travel in a different way, then our recommendation would be to choose direct flights and not switch flights along the way and have a couple of hours waiting time. It could be a lower cost, but you need to take into the consideration the total travel time. And then if you look into CO2 emissions, if you take 2 flights instead of 1, it will obviously generate more emissions.
And how about from a hotel perspective? It feels like it's a little bit more nuanced with hotels over point-to-point travel.
Yeah. So that's a great question. And I've been looking into this as well. And I see a lot of movement and a lot of good activities. There is not, I would say, a detailed CO2 follow-up on hotel in general. My advice would be to actually look at the hotel chains that you put the biggest volumes. So for instance, if you put your biggest volumes on a certain chains, you can approach that chain and ask if they have any specific figures, for the measurement that they have in place, depending if it's a 2-star, 3-star, or 4-star property or whatever. Some hotels have come quite far, and they can actually offer you generic measurement that you can use when calculating number of room nights. Hopefully, we will come to the point where actually there will be, I would say, more official figures, but it really depends of the classification system of the hotels, and everything, how much energy they use, and food consumption. All of that comes into the perspective.
And so my final question is, if we think more about those organizations who are a bit more mature in their programs when it comes to sustainability and travel, are there any kind of hidden or untapped opportunities that you often see?
Yeah. So yes, absolutely. I think this is key. And again, I think it's important if you're going to make an impact and really try to achieve change and reach your goals. You need to take it one step further and look to tier 2 suppliers. I think cooperation, both internally and externally, is really important. And if you're in procurement and you're working with different supply chains, it really depends how far you have come and how much time and knowledge you have. If it's difficult for yourself to do the assessment, of your tier 2 suppliers, you can get external help with third-party companies who are expert in this, who can help you do the measurement. But some of the things that I've seen with companies that try to make an impact, things like car fleet. If for instance, a company has company cars, just by looking at the data and the CO2 emissions generated from their own company cars, could really have a big impact if you follow up on that and make conscious choices. So there's a lot to do, but it also takes quite a bit of work and knowledge to be able to do it.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast, part of our special series in partnership with Egencia, Pandemic Pressures, 4 key pillars to evaluate in your corporate travel program. You can listen to all the other episodes in this series by going to artofprocurement.com/travel21. That's artofprocurement.com/travel21.